Hello and welcome to the Columbia Daily Tribune's Behind the Stripes football webcast. This is Tribune sports editor Joe Waljesper along with Tribune football beat writer David Morrison. David, Missouri heading into its season opener against the South Dakota State Jackrabbits. To start with, give us a quick rundown of the Jackrabbits and whether you think they have a puncher's chance of hanging in there with the Tigers.
Yeah, well, I mean, they seem like a better Murray State from last season. I mean, Murray State wasn't ranked coming into the year, and South Dakota State's ranked 10th in the FCS poll. And they're similar in the fact that the defense doesn't really look like it can give Missouri any trouble. Like, this should be a game unless, the scrimmages were an indication of something more endemic in the offense. This should be a game where Missouri is able to go up and down the field and score pretty much at will. But I can see South Dakota State giving them a little bit of trouble on defense, probably even more trouble than Murray State, which, if you'll remember, they put up a ton of yards and scored 2 touchdowns in the first quarter against Missouri last year.
I don't remember.
Well,
it's all a blur.
I'm happy to jog your memory then. But yeah, South Dakota State, they can hit you in a lot of different ways. I mean, they've got a back-to-back 2,000-yard rusher in Zach Zenner, who's put up big numbers against Nebraska and Kansas, FBS competition. And they've got
sort of.
Right. Well, Nebraska.
Stretching the truth with the game. Okay.
And then they've got a quarterback in Austin Sumner who's started for a couple years for them. They've got a 1,000-yard receiver coming back in Jason Schneider, who's 6'5", 225. Pretty big guy. So, I mean, they can do some stuff on offense, and, I mean, it will be a pretty good test of Missouri's defense at this point, whether they were as good as we think they were from watching the scrimmage or whether maybe Missouri's offense just was kind of struggling and the defense is maybe not as good as we thought they were.
Okay. Missouri releases, obviously, its first depth chart of the season. Just your thoughts, anything on there grab you, surprising?
I mean, there weren't really that many big surprises. I mean, it was kind of a surprise to see Eddie Prince move above Corbin Bergstresser as the backup quarterback because, I mean, in the limited things we got to see, it didn't look like either of them really separated himself from the other, in the scrimmages. They both just played okay, really, against the first offense. But, I mean, obviously the coaches got to see them a lot more than we did, and they liked what they saw at Eddie Prince a little bit better. So that was a mild surprise.
And if it's a draw, maybe you want the younger guy.
Right, yeah. You want to give him the chance to season more in his redshirt freshman year and things like that. I mean, it was kind of a mild surprise to see Marcus Murphy listed at tailback just because I thought they might, move him out to the slot if Jimmy Hunt and Gavinati were still having injury issues, but evidently it's Morgan Stewart who still has the injury issues, so I think that's a big reason why he's at tailback. And then also Harold Brantley, who's been kind of like the mystery man since spring where nobody really knows what's going on with him, listed as an or starter at defensive tackle with Matt Hoke. I mean, you could see him working with the 2s and 1s over fall camp, but then you also remembered back to the spring and the summer where he was running with the 4s and nobody really knew what was happening. So it's kind of interesting to see that he's kind of regained his third starter spot. And then in special teams, I thought it was interesting, too, that they put Ian Simon above Marcus Murphy at kick returner because, Marcus Murphy's handled that each of the last 2 years. And Gary Pinkel said they want to kind of lighten his load a little bit on special teams so he can do more on offense. But the thing about Simon is, I mean, he said he hadn't returned a kick since high school. So it's going to be kind of interesting to see how he adapts to that in a game situation.
Yeah, I think more so than you would think when you're talking about a third-string tailback, the Morgan Stewart injury situation, a lot of things kind of hinge on that. And it's sort of, Pinkel's kind of been a little vague about what's going on there, whether this is really going to be more of a long-term thing or not, because if he's healthy, then you probably could afford to play Marcus Murphy more in the slot, but if he's not, then you can't, and so then that starts affecting other people in other parts of the depth chart. So for a third-string spot, it seems to have a little bit more value than what you would think. The other side of that is I think it also sort of affects, do you want to redshirt some of those running backs? And Gary Pinkel said on Monday that no, they're gonna play Ish Witter as a true freshman, which is he will be one of the 5 that he anticipates playing. The other ones being Lawrence Lee, the receiver, Nate Brown, the receiver, Logan Cheadle, the corner, and Thomas Wilson, the defensive back. Of that group, is that sort of who you would have expected to get on the field?
Yeah, the only one that was kind of surprising to me was Thomas Wilson.
Hadn't heard much about him.
It seemed like he kind of flew under the radar a lot during fall camp. I mean, he played mostly with the 3 defense. He actually picked off Marvin Zanders in the first scrimmage, so that was, a plus for him in a game situation, but that was like with the 3s and 4s. And he played very sparingly with the 2s, so yeah, it was kind of interesting to see him to see him in that mix. But Gary Pinkel said they were going to use him as a backup nickelback more to Deron Singleton, which also I didn't know he was working at. I thought he was purely a safety. But I guess they're moving Kenyon Dennis out to the perimeter, and so they want Thomas Wilson in there as a nickel. I mean, the other guys you could kind of see coming. I mean, it was going to be a close call between Ish Witter and Trevon Walters. But Ish Witter got more time with the 2s and 1s than Walters did, even though they both got a little bit of time kind of with the top groups during the scrimmages. And then they needed at least 2 receivers to play this year just by sheer numbers, and Brown and Lee were the ones who got the most run with the upper teams, and then Logan Cheadle also played almost exclusively with the 2s, so you knew he was in the mix too. So I mean, it wasn't that big of a surprise, and at least at running back and receiver, it's almost a necessity thing where they just need bodies at those positions. I mean, with Cheadle and Wilson, they could maybe afford to redshirt them if they weren't as far along as they wanted to be, but I think they needed at least 3 freshmen at running back and receiver to play, and they might even need to call up Trevon Walters or Thomas Richard or Deshaun Blair at some point if injuries kind of beset those positions.
Okay. 3 scrimmages, what we saw of the preseason. Obviously, we weren't allowed to watch anything other than stretching at practices. Anything you saw in those scrimmages that maybe changed your expectations for this team from what they might have been at the beginning of August?
I don't know about changed expectations on the whole. I think the offense might have a little more trouble picking up last year than I thought it would. I mean, I thought Mock's quarterbacking would be enough to kind of lift the receiving core around him and kind of make it so that it wasn't that big of a drop-off from what James Franklin did with his big 3 last year. But it just seems like, I don't know whose fault it is, but it just seems like both sides are kind of off right now with each other. I mean, you can easily look at that and say, well, it's just 3 bad days, and he probably was fine in the other 17 practices of fall camp or something like that. But just some of the things that you saw during the scrimmages are some of the things that almost got him into trouble last year, forcing the ball into tight windows and overthrowing people that are open and things like that. So again, and not hitting on deep balls, which was such a huge part of the offense last year, was the kind of the slant and go, double move, 40-yard gain to LaDainian Washington down the sideline play that just has been absent really from the scrimmages. So it just seems as if, like I said, I don't know whose fault it is, but it seems as if they're kind of not meshing right now as a group, and so I think maybe it might take a little bit longer for the offense to get back to where it was last year, if it even does.
Well, last year, Matty Mock, really, he was stepping in a situation where he was surrounded by really good playmakers, and it was like, here, let us help you do this and get through this situation. And now it's kind of more a situation where he doesn't have a lot of playmakers around him. He has to be the one sort of making things happen. So that's a pretty significant difference. We'll see. As I said last week, I don't get too carried away with what happens in these scrimmages, because it always seems like the defense. You'll walk away from a scrimmage thinking the defense has everything figured out, and then the games start, and it tends to go back to what Missouri traditionally has had, which is the offense is actually probably a little more of a strength than the defense. Maybe different this year, but we've seen this a few times before where we were guessing the defense was all over much better than the offense, and it didn't pan out. Lastly, at the end of last week, we had another bit of Missouri controversy, another outside the lines piece, this one on Derek Washington, pointing at 2 more incidents from his past that were publicly unknown, but were known to Missouri's coaches and athletic administration and apparently university administration. He wasn't disciplined in those times and was allowed to stay in school, and which led to him assaulting more women. So it was pretty, I think as PR hits go, it was significant. Missouri chose not to comment to ESPN, so it was strictly from the point of view of everyone but the Missouri decision makers, which I think is a very highly questionable strategy, but one they generally take. So I guess the question is, we've seen several of these in the last couple of years of Missouri, for lack of a better term, being very soft on issues of violence towards women from their athletes until, you find out after the fact that this has all happened. To what extent do you blame Missouri for those decisions, or to what extent do you think at the time they did what they thought was right and then it all went to hell later?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess the one encouraging thing is that this is all still from 2008 through 2010. It's not as if it's things that are happening last week, even though, I don't know, maybe in 2020.
Maybe that will be an outside the lines in 2018.
We'll see those sorts of things. But I mean, that's, if you can find any sort of silver lining in these clouds, it's that it was from that period that has already been explored, and that Missouri has admitted they've had failures in. And the Title IX legislation's been on the books for 40 years. Like, it's not as if it's a new thing that got introduced last week. So there's no way that people just don't know about it, you know? But then also the Department of Education had to send out the Dear Colleague letter in 2011 just because so many people were ignorant of the process and ignorant of who to tell and, where to run it up the flagpole and things like that. So, I mean, I guess I can kind of believe that Mike Alden and Gary Pingle and people like that just didn't know the procedure. But I also believe that if they wanted to know it better, they could have,
right.
So I think
you just hit on it right there. In that, I think in all these cases, they're working backwards from the premise, from the result they want, which is that the athlete stays on the team and that all this awful news gets somehow buried. And when you do that, you don't ask as many questions as you should. You don't show any real curiosity about what really happened. I mean, it's easy to say, well, he wasn't charged, so out of my hands. But like, I know you talked to the assistant prosecutor at the time who decided not to press charges on the rape of 2008. And he said no one from Missouri, am I right? He said no one from Missouri contacted him. And if they had contacted him, he probably would have told them, well, I probably would have prosecuted this rape, except for some of the things her boyfriend said about suggesting that she should try to blackmail the coaches. So there's a lot of reasons a case doesn't get prosecuted. And to simply say, well, he wasn't charged, is like, well, but why? And so there again, I think if you were at that point in time getting ready to hire Derek Washington for a job, I think you would ask a lot more questions about people than if you're working backwards from the premise of, we really want him to be on our team and we really don't want it to be all over the news that he has raped someone. So I think, you can talk about the Title IX side of it, and that too, I don't know that ignorance is a great excuse for that, but I think just overall, and it's not just with football, it was with basketball too, that you had athletes doing things that people knew were wrong and just hoping that the time bomb wouldn't go off while they were still here, and the time bomb did go off in a couple of cases.
Right.
So on that note, we'll part for this week. Next week we'll be back to talk about the South Dakota State game and look forward to Missouri's visit to Toledo.